Essentially, your application consists of a statement of purpose, a personal statement, letters of recommendation, and a portfolio of creative work with a 15 megabyte limit, incidentally. So what exactly is the portfolio of creative work and what constitutes this? For applicants with an architecture background, it may seem easier to populate the portfolio with architecture projects, but as you know, we have students and applicants from a diverse range of backgrounds, myself included. I did not have an architectural background. So the question then becomes, what do you show in your portfolio? There is no right way. All portfolios are different. Any samples of creative work, music, fine art, writing, even high-level mathematics could qualify, in my opinion. And of course, if you participate in the summer program or any of the AUD summer programs or other summer programs for that matter, that work should definitely be included. A bit of advice, just to kind of kick off the conversation, is to keep a narrow focus. In other words, support your application always. The things that you are, your accolades, your qualities that are coming through in your application should be supported by your portfolio, so that the net effect is that you have a very cohesive, clear application package and everything is kind of working in concert. You should ask, have you demonstrated a range of skills and capacities relevant to your application? I.e., what are your strengths? What are your interests? Play to your strengths and your interests. We all have weaknesses. This is definitely not the place to dwell on them. You should focus on the positive. I would also ask, does your portfolio relate to your written statement? I.e., is the body of your entire application consistent? So support your portfolio with your references. Ideally, letters of recommendation should support your portfolio as well. So overlap your letters of recommendation with some of the content in the portfolio so we can, in effect, hear a commentary about the kind of work that you're showing and your qualifications for entering into architecture school. I would say also it's more important to demonstrate your ability to graphically communicate your ideas, kind of your position, a unique character as an applicant, than it is to demonstrate competence in making architecture. Graduate school is for developing competence in making architecture. What we're after is for you to demonstrate a particular skill set or kind of knowledge, and I would argue, more importantly, a capacity to think sort of analytically and rationally through an architectural problem. That's the kind of stuff that is relevant for us to see, and that's what we're going to be looking for. What kind of organizational criteria exists in portfolios? Your portfolio should read clearly at various scales. So what that means is each project or sample should first be legible quickly. I might kind of cite an example of a roadside billboard here. It's gettable at 60 miles an hour. Your portfolio should function the same way. There are deeper readings of each sample as people and reviewers read your applications that they can focus in on and dive into. But the initial concept for each of the portfolios should be clear and legible up front. So there's a hierarchy of information, much the same way that you would construct a written essay, for instance, with kind of an opening introduction at each paragraph or at each chapter of a novel, and then supporting information, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Above all, clarity should be the primary concern. So consider who is reviewing your portfolio and in what context. When applying to schools, they are trying to get to know you as a creative, design-oriented individual. That may mean something quite different for different persons. You should be able to answer that for yourself and make your own position about this and demonstrate with as much clarity as possible what that position is to the reviewer or whoever will be looking at your applications. And lastly, and this may seem sort of obvious, edit wisely. Spend your time accordingly. You're going to be submitting a lot of applications. Time is presumably finite. We can work on these kind of things endlessly. get the important information in and make sure that it's consistent, and then work on editing the portfolio consistently across all projects and all levels, so that when there is time and when there is a desire to present more information, it's consistent across all of the projects, so that not one project is super developed and another is lacking in development. I would also recommend having a third party review your portfolio for clarity, whether they have an architectural background or not. In fact, I think personally, someone who does not have an architectural background may be a wise reviewer, because it will really hold you accountable for clarity. That is, are your concepts legible for a variety of audience and not simply an academic audience? And then, of course, if you have access to someone in the academy or someone in the profession, that can't hurt either. Some basic design tips. So in other words, don't forget the following. This is kind of another architectural cliche. Less is more. Focus on content and composition, not on fancy typefaces or distracting visual noise. Use an invisible grid throughout to help you organize your page layouts. That seems obvious, but I think certainly in a time of digital presentations, you're seeing as I'm scrolling through these samples, that images, titles aren't flickering. They're in the same position on each page. Consider that your portfolio may be reviewed digitally or in paper format, and should be formatted so that it can read clearly and legibly in both formats. And then just to kind of wrap up this introduction, I would also I'm going to kind of plug the summer program and encourage you to consider that, because I think it's a great opportunity to sort of expand what you're going to be doing for these portfolios and add some architectural work, even some proto-architectural work. And I think will really allow reviewers to get a deeper insight into your capacities as a student architect. So please sign up for the mailing list and additional information related to this workshop, as well as other helpful tips. That's going to be distributed to you as part of I think the whole open house content. So lastly, I want to just open this up for conversation and Q&A and answer any questions you might have. You can raise your hands or simply unmute, whatever you prefer, and I'll try to get to questions. You can also, it's helpful for you to post your questions in the chat, and that way I can follow along and get to some of your questions sort of in a more systematic way. So let's go ahead and open it up for questions. And if you want to see some more samples of the portfolio, I'm happy to open it back up and go back to it, but maybe this kind of face-to-face format is more conducive to conversation and questions.
I would like to ask you about whether you have any advice or input on the role of professional images or professional work in an architectural portfolio to grad school. And do you have any tips or pointers on how to curate that information relative to maybe a personal project? If there are any key differences, or whether professional work is even a viable thing to put into a grad school portfolio?
I'm gonna, and I'll try to be concise, but I think this is gonna vary. Your advice will vary from person to person. I may have a different opinion than somebody else, but for my part, I would say absolutely. I think it's very important, and I'm very fussy about format and organization. So I would say yes, professional work is important. I would be very focused about how you present professional work. So I'll talk just about the nature of professional work first. Maybe show a beautiful drawing, a presentation drawing for a competition entry that you worked on, and less about construction documents or technical drawings, for instance, things that ultimately can be taught or learned during graduate school and after graduate school. So communicate that you worked on the project, show things that also maybe are plausible and may relate to your hand specifically. So consider if you worked for a major corporate firm, let's say like OMA in New York, and you worked on a competition entry and you show the entire competition entry, it's going to be difficult for a reviewer to see where you had a specific impact on that project. So I would keep that in mind and ask, can you show something that's very specific and narrow that you worked on? Then zooming out, I would say it's important to balance that with personal projects and perhaps even some very creative things. So in my mind, a really rounded out portfolio would be something that talks about perhaps even an art project, photography, something of that nature, professional practice experience, and some personal projects that you might include. That would tell us really that you have a capacity to kind of operate creatively in your own and some experience working in kind of the architectural environment professionally. I would consider that a very well-rounded portfolio. So it's certainly in that instance, I think, yes, it's a good idea.
My question is, it's more like, I don't know. And so I work in the design field. I work at an interior design firm, and I do a lot of elevations, and I work with CAD a lot. And I'm wondering, would you think it's smart to have like elevations and things like that you've done for work for construction purposes in our portfolio, or is that like, would that not be appropriate to have on our portfolio?
I think yes, I think it's a good idea to include those things. But again, I would be very specific about including, let's say, elevations or types of drawings or graphic or visual material that really shows your capacity to operate creatively, let's say, as an architectural student. Don't worry too much about the technical competence. It's nice if a particular technical drawing really communicates the ambition of a project and it's something that you played a consistent hand in or a very active role. Sure, absolutely include it. But just remember that you're not applying for a job in an architectural office. You're applying for graduate school and everything that precedes that in your professional career. That seems like an obvious thing to say, but I think something that we all forget as we go through this process.
Yeah, no, definitely. Thank you. I appreciate that.
Of course.
And we have a couple questions in the chat, and I'll
Yep.
just read the first one. What are some of the most common mistakes you see in portfolios?
I think a common mistake, or something that I would say is I wouldn't say is not really helping your application, is that the portfolio is a completely different artifact from the remainder of your application. So I said it in my introduction a little bit, but I think very important to make a compelling, well-rounded case for why you are a good candidate for graduate school. And that means a written statement, recommendations, and a portfolio that all work in support. So when those three things are separate or different, I think your application as a whole becomes fragmented. And I would always encourage to push clarity and one part of the application supporting the other, always.
The next question, and you might have covered this already, but do you have any tips for non-architecture background applicants?
Any tips? That's a very broad question, and I'll try to answer it. I'll kind of answer it from a personal perspective. I have very limited architectural experience applying for graduate school. I did have some. I worked at a large corporate office building models and such. And so I had some models that I showed as that was kind of one specific, and some architectural that was one specific component of my portfolio. And I ended up actually in my final applications really focusing on a fine arts project, like a whole portfolio of things that I think related to architectural drawing and had a logic that was related to architectural thinking. That's a logic that was in my application. It was kind of communicated in my application and my interests. And it's something that I'm still interested in practice today, so it hasn't gone away. But I ended up kind of taking away some of the more specific architectural work and focusing on a case for what I wanted to achieve as a student and what my interests relating to architecture were, both graphically and in the writing and applications, if that makes sense. So I think for me as a with a non-architectural background, I wanted to demonstrate my ability to think architecturally and speak to that, like those strengths, as opposed to dwelling on the fact that I didn't, like have any architectural projects to show from undergraduate, which I, again, to always make your case positively and proactively, as opposed to trying to address what are perceived deficiencies that may not exist at all.
The next question is, does your portfolio matter more than your bachelor's GPA?
I cannot answer that question. It's very difficult to answer. I would say they're both going to be relevant. I mean, we are going to look at your grades and it's going to vary from reviewer to reviewer, I think. And as a matter of policy, I think they're both relevant. I don't really know that I can be too specific about it. I think, obviously, if you have an opportunity to really let your portfolio shine, and perhaps you have a less than perfect GPA, you probably make a very good candidate. I personally, reviewing that application, would be compelled, and it may be different for other reviewers, for instance.
The next question up is, how relevant is the personal graphical narrative and layout of the portfolio? Hang on, it slipped past the page here. How relevant is the personal graphical narrative and layout of the portfolio opposed to the actual content and drawings?
Oh boy, that's a good one. I think it's super relevant. It's something that I would always be looking for. Specifically, as I talked about, the ability to organize information in a very legible way across scales. That's the stuff of architectural presentation. It's something that you're going to have to do in graduate school consistently. So a simple way of saying that is that in graduate school, your ideas only exist if you can present them effectively and put them sort of on the wall, whether they're presented virtually on the wall or literally on the wall. A project is only as good as your presentation, as how you show it and how you defend it verbally. So to take your portfolio and, as I mentioned, allow it to be read first at kind of at a zoomed out scale and be very legible, and then allow for deeper readings embedded in that, and have an organization, like a line that organizes all of that consistently, the same way a good essay is constructed with a consistent organization and body. I think that's super important and something that I certainly would be looking for as I review an application.
How do you suggest providing written work if it is as important as an important aspect to our work?
That's challenging, because where does it go in the application, right? I mean, you have your essay, and I would say, sort of broadly speaking, the writing in the essay could be in support of your portfolio. So you could, as opposed to, let's say, including a lot of text or writing in a portfolio in support of a project, which you can do, and I showed some examples of that. I personally would be looking more to take whatever graphic and content you have, maybe with some supporting writing or headings or text, but I would be trying to support that in my written narrative or essay. And a way to look at that is to take your project or your interest and break it out over the whole form of your application, and not simply to address it only in the portfolio.
Should your portfolio primarily reflect your ability to think creatively and ability to work through a design process over showcasing technical skill?
Karen, wonderful question. You nailed it. That's it. That's the whole point of this discussion in my mind. That's exactly what your portfolio should do. What we're looking for is, are you adept and capable of learning to become an architect, and your ability to think creatively and ability to work through the design process is at the heart of that. How many pages in a portfolio, or how many pages in a portfolio? That's difficult to say. There's some different schools of thought about this. I feel like it's very challenging for me to say. I mean, we could simply also, let me look at one of these examples here that I've got and give you like an idea. So some of the samples I showed might be like 20 samples long. I think that's reasonable. I might say that somewhere between 15 and 30, but I think it could vary dramatically. if there's a consistent body of work that spans 10 pages and it's very clear and legible, that could be stronger than 30 pages of more fragmented work that's perhaps not as legible. So be very good editors and look at what's being communicated as opposed to falling into the trap of how much there is, or I need to show this because I did this. Again, I would always consider your narrative in your application and your narrative as a student of architecture, your personal story, as the litmus test for what you're showing in your portfolio. They should always be in alignment.
Is there a specific number of portfolio topics that you should show in your portfolio?
Another impossible question, but I'll take a crack at it. I think ideally, if I would say like 3 topics or projects or subtopics seems like kind of a minimum to me. Could you do it with 1? I mean, it would be very ambitious. There would have to be a very good reason for that. So I'm thinking that's probably difficult if I'm just kind of speaking broadly. 2 topics, as in I'm interested in this and I'm also interested in this. I think it's possible, but again, it would have to be a very compelling case. What kind of an application would fall into that? Perhaps you are a visual artist and a sociology major. I think that's very compelling and interesting. That could be a very interesting combination of backgrounds for an education in architecture. So if somehow a portfolio could reflect that, that's possible. If it's more a collection of projects or works, if you do have a background, then I would go more with 3 relevant projects or 5 relevant projects. So I suppose what I'm kind of backing into then indirectly is that a portfolio for a non-architectural background could differ in terms of the amount of subcategories or major categories compared with a portfolio from an applicant that has an architectural background.
On admissions, on the admissions page, it says to submit the portfolio as single sheets. Does that mean, whoops, some more chat. Does that mean a single page or 1 spread?
I believe we're referring to a spread. So if it was a digital submission, which I don't believe we're taking, I think we're still taking physical submissions. They should be, so physical submissions, individual sheets bound together, and digital submissions, if for any reason, like 1 PDF or 1 spread, to answer that more directly. I would also say if there are any questions or just comments and you want to engage some of your fellow applicants and students too, or don't be afraid to ask sort of more non-specific questions, or sometimes I'm happy to kind of open the conversation a little bit and be a little bit more fluid in terms of what we're talking about here. I know we're always limited for places to ask these questions in the open house, and in addition to the breakout rooms, and the portfolio workshop is a great opportunity. So if there's anything that I can kind of explain or extrapolate on a little bit more, feel free to ask here.
This is still a specific question, but it might be easier to vocalize than type.
Sure.
And going back for non-background students who maybe have more experience in research on topics that blend other disciplines in architecture, but from say like a humanities or social science perspective, I've heard sometimes of students like taking a senior thesis and then turn to like on the side abstract like design projects or like collage projects and stuff from that for a design portfolio, kind of to like show that they have a background in architecture that maybe wouldn't traditionally fit a portfolio. So I was wondering if you had any thoughts on that. I
mean, I think that's a fantastic idea. I get really excited about something like that because I think there's 2 things that I really like about that idea. One is that there's a written narrative or some verbal content that organizes a particular line of thinking. So to then translate that line of thinking or that project into the graphic, for me at least, in my practice and my understanding of architecture, that's critical. And I would argue that interrogating whatever you produce as an architect, either post-graduate school or during graduate school as a student, relies heavily on that narrative. You know, you're always interrogating the work through the narrative, you're developing the work through the narrative, you need a thesis to test architecturally. So to be able to communicate that and roll that into your application and demonstrate that, I think would be very strong.
Can I ask, I know a lot of schools have different takes on this, and I'd love to know your perspective and maybe if you can share what UCLA's thoughts are around including photography and or ceramics in a portfolio, and kind of what parameters there are or what considerations one might have when wanting to do that.
I don't think there are any parameters or considerations. I think that ceramics or photography sound like a wonderful addition. Again, for me, so let's talk about ceramics for a second. If there's a particular project, like how are ceramics related to architecture? I'm going to look for how are you thinking through the problem of ceramics, right? And if there's a particular kind of relationship to like physical form or an idea of making or a particular kind of style, or even if there's an organization to the way you're approaching your project of making ceramics. And by your project, I mean like your larger, like not just one individual ceramic project, but like the line of work that you produce. I think that would be incredibly strong. Look for relationships, and they don't have to be one-to-one translations. There are relationships that relate to the idea of how you talk and think about ceramics as applicable to architecture. I think there's a tremendous amount of overlap. As it goes with photography, I'll go back to the narrative again and say that you can tell a story visually, you can tell a story through words, and your ability to kind of demonstrate that in a portfolio of photography is completely relevant to architecture. Much more so than, say, photographing architecture, right? To kind of point out the obvious, but I think it's worth noting. I have a couple more in the chat, and I'm happy to take some more live questions too. Linda, do you want to keep running through these, or do you want me just to take these one by one?
No, I can read these off for you. Do you have any tips about how I can present my architectural animations or my scripting and coding ability in the portfolio?
That's a really good question. I mean, if it's an analog, a physical submission, then how can you do that? I mean, in my mind, that's an opportunity to kind of, yes, we use animations in architecture all the time. And it's one way to communicate a project. I personally find that there's something very interesting about making a project of translating that information back into kind of a still image. So perhaps to be able to take an animation and find a clever or interesting way to distill an image or extract a particular image could be a very good way of doing that, for instance, as opposed to simply like sending a thumb drive and saying, plug this in, you know? I hope that answers your question.
The next question is, if you have the technical drawings in the portfolio, is it important to include things like scales, north arrows?
I think if you are showing technical drawings, so I'm going to just talk about like a couple different kinds of drawing here. There is, and I'll kind of boil it down to something that I think is very like distilled and simple. If there is a drawing that's meant to communicate sort of a particular attitude or a particular scene, that's maybe more about kind of representation in the abstract, then no, it probably doesn't need that information. If there's a technical drawing that's sort of semi-technical, that is like perhaps more on the minimal side, a beautiful line work drawing that's meant to communicate the form of an object, of a building, a beautiful site plan, a drawing like that, it's possible that like if it's related to site, of course, include a north arrow or some kind of information to indicate that it's sort of describing a condition in time and space, and that's north. If it's a very technical drawing, like you want to show a specific wall section that you produced in an architecture office, that's particularly beautiful and it communicates a particular way of thinking about an architectural problem, then yes, once you open up that door and you show that technical drawing, it needs all the bells and whistles that go along with it.
Do you have any examples of non-architectural background portfolios that you can show?
I can run through some of these samples that that I showed earlier. Let me just I'm going to share screen again 1 second. I'm going to kind of slide through here quickly. So these are more kind of projects of an architectural nature here up front. But as we go, we get to portfolio 3. I'm going to flash through these kind of quickly. Here we go. Fine arts images. I mean, I think this would be a great example of kind of a thesis or a fine arts project that I think relates to architecture, both graphically and in terms of kind of intention. So that I would argue that there's a particular kind of organization in these images, in this work, that's conducive to kind of an architectural thinking or an architectural project. That this would be a pretty good example. Here's another version. And then, I mean, I think some of these are very related to architecture, almost directly to architectural drawing. This will be a more architectural version. And then this, I think, is more about information and the presentation of information. But certainly an architectural thesis. And then something that talks about historical preservation. I think this is a good example, and certainly something that you can include in a portfolio as a very specific commentary on these images. I would say this is not a very compelling opening slide. It's taking me a long time to understand exactly what I'm looking at. So I might argue that this is perhaps not the best example of clarity. That leading with a slide like this, that kind of shows the larger project and it becomes gettable easily at an arm's length, would be a better opening slide for something like this. And then these are some kind of hybrid portfolio projects that are related to architecture, I think, but not directly. Hopefully, some photography. Those are some good examples as well.
Someone wanted to know if they could add an architectural design walkthrough, like an animation file, to the application portal. And that is no. We can't have animation files. It would be a PDF, that type of thing.
Exactly. And I think that goes back to our discussion earlier about like finding clever and smart ways of relaying that, communicating that information if it's important in a still. And I think that in itself, the project of doing that is a worthy project for a portfolio.
And here's another question about, I took part in a biennial as an assistant curator, and I'm having trouble articulating visually what my part and thought process was in the project. Does that...
Wow, that's a great question. Linda, do you want to answer this one? This is challenging. I mean, that's a really wonderful question. I'm really glad you're asking it. But that's challenging. This is one of those things where you're talking about, let's say, a visual project, but the project is actually curating that information, right? So, boy, the kind of overly ambitious part of me wants to say, to try to kind of describe that, like, for instance, I would think as far as curation, and this resonates with me a little bit because I have a fine arts background and worked in the kind of museum world for some time before going to graduate school in architecture. And I've often wondered about how would I describe it? Like if I was curating a show, how would I be able to describe that? I mean, I could be very specific and I could actually work through the model and say that there is a model of the project that physically shows how things were installed and what your concept for that curation was, or whether you're, and what the concept was that you played a role in as an assistant or as an assistant curator and a designer of that show. Another way would be to communicate that graphically and kind of lay out a thesis, perhaps the same way that you would, let's say, consider applying as an artist for a grant or for a show somewhere, where you would have to make a compelling argument for how you would want your work shown, what is the thesis, and kind of imply how that would be curated. So that's a complicated project, but I think the project of trying to communicate the larger ambitions of a curated installation, that's a really good project to tackle for a portfolio. I hope you have a lot of time on your hands. It sounds ambitious, but I love the idea.
In a similar question, some portfolios require contributions. How is that handled? How is that best represented into the spread?
Can we extrapolate on that about what's exactly meant by contributions? Ellen, can you kind of clarify a little bit, or do you feel comfortable talking if you just want to type a clarification? Or just ask the question? Maybe you can kind of extrapolate or specify a little bit more. Project contributions. So you mean if you were a contributor as one of many to a single project, the way you would just cite, like a citation? Yeah, I think it's just a citation. There's a lot of different formats for doing this. It's not, in writing, we have very specific formats for citations. In an architecture portfolio, I think that can be a little bit looser. I think it's important just to be consistent through the portfolio. So to talk about the project team, I think is a good idea. And yourself as one of the contributors is always good. So if it's a list of persons and you show up in that list, that's a good way to do that. And then simply replicating that for each project.
A specific question. I'm a transfer student. I got like my associate degree in architecture actually, and I'm currently studying urban studies. So if my portfolio is mainly focused on the projects that I didn't studio hours, would that like be enough, or do I have to not just focus like on the projects or like just technical side?
I think you could do either. I think it would be enough, but again, I would just I don't want to answer it so obliquely, but I think just decide what is going to be the most compelling case for you to make. I don't think you have to spread yourself too thin and add more things just for the sake of adding. You can be very focused and focus on that information, but that's kind of up to you. Does that answer your question? And if you want to extrapolate, I'm happy to talk about it more. I hope I answered your question, sort of.
No, that's okay. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. There's a question about the GRE score in here. I have a hard time answering that one. Linda, you might know even more than I do. It's been such a long time. I don't know if I can say how relevant the GRE score is.
It's one of those things. It's relevant. It's a requirement, but I think the portfolio and the personal statement and your overall GPA makes just as strong a statement.
I think that's probably right. And I feel comfortable saying that the GRE, it's more of a box that you need to check. Like you need to achieve a certain score. It's sort of like the baseline standard that you should achieve. But I think if I had to go out on a limb and make a case, I would say really the application in the portfolio is the most critical. What do you want to see, don't want to see on a portfolio cover? I did see that question earlier and we haven't answered it yet. On a portfolio cover, I think it really can just be like your name, what you're applying to, and referencing like the bare essentials for what needs to be included so that we can file it appropriately and include it in your application. I don't know that the cover needs to be particularly, I don't know if there's a particular criteria. I'm sure that in the application instructions there, you want your full name, the program that you're applying to, so that we can make sure that it gets filed correctly with your application. But short of that, I don't think there's any specific criteria. Thanks, G. An honest, informative open house. Great. That's what we
gonna
aim for.
Right? We're gonna
Honest and
screen cap.
informative.
We're gonna grab that one.
Yeah, that's great. Let's live it. Let's publish that somewhere.
Right. I want to thank everyone that stuck with us. I know we had some technical issues getting everybody from the breakout sessions into this room. So thank you for persevering and coming over here. And I want to thank Ben Freyinger for such an informative session. I learned a lot.
I did learn a lot. There's one more question about the GRE and applying without the GRE. I don't believe you can. I don't know that it's possible to waive the GRE, but I also don't want to answer that definitively. So I'm going to have to pass that one up the ladder to somebody in administration.
That's a challenging one. So I'm gonna post admissions at aud.ucla.edu, and that's gonna go to our student advisors. And I'll just put that again. I'll put that in the chat so everybody can see
I put it in already.
Oh, you got it? Okay, thank you.
And that's great. And I also just want to reiterate that really nice to meet everybody, and hopefully some of these faces are faces that we'll get to see in the fall upcoming. So I hope you come to UCLA. It's a great place. I've been here. Oh my gosh, Linda, it's embarrassing. I've been here for a long time.
We, Albert and I, another staff member in the session, we have been here a long time too.
Thanks everybody for joining.
Thank you all.